Welcome to the newest podcast of the Canadian Open Neuroscience Platform, CONP. My name is Nikola Stikov, and today I will be speaking with Bartha Knoppers, Director of the Centre of Genomics and Policy at McGill University. Bartha is the Canada Research Chair in Law and Medicine since 2001, and recently she was appointed Chair of the CONP Committee on Ethics and Governance. Bartha, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Usually we start these interviews with just some generic questions about open science and what open science means to you.
I actually did some research recently and found out there were about 15 interpretations of open science. I've gone back to how I understand it. I see open science as supporting discovery science in the sense that open science creates the infrastructures for data sharing, for making known what you've discovered, putting it back in the system, allowing others to understand it and use it. And by this form of sort of data sharing, at least at one level, the normal one is aggregate kind of statistical data, but another level that's richer than that in terms of the types of data that are now available across the board, we can not only understand what discovery science has told us, but we can use it to avoid doing the same experiment again and move forward, because everybody now knows what the results of your research.
Can you tell us a little bit about your role in the CONP?
I've spent probably the last 10 years or so looking for ways to facilitate, promote, catalyze, foster, find all the verbs that you like, data sharing in a governed way, in a way that one respects privacy, where privacy is what people want, not some people just want to give everything away and they don't care, but privacy protecting way in a secure way, but in a way that is usable and accessible by others. So various international consortia, and when I say consortia, I mean different bodies from, let's say cancer, International Cancer Genome Consortium, International Human Epigenome Consortium, and so on, who want to share between different countries their data, since Canada has a lot of immigrants and we come from there, and there's a lot of insights that can be gained by international data sharing. So CONP is Canadian, and we'd like to create that kind of platform for data sharing here in Canada.
Thank you. And I guess Canada is in a unique position, but it's not a very populous country. Do you find that to be an advantage or a disadvantage?
Are you asking populist politics or population?
Population-wise.
That's just a trick question. Population-wise, yes. We need other countries because for statistical significance, you need a lot of data. And we need other countries because we come from other countries. I mean, I don't know what the percentage, the latest I heard was that was over 60% of Canadians come from other countries. And so if we come from there and our grandparents were born there, then our health today must be related to our origins in other countries. So we need to share for both reasons.
Can you tell us a little bit about your committee and the priorities of the Ethics and Governance Committee as part of the CONP?
Well, we're drowning in work. In a way, ethics and governance kickstarts the rest of the project. To build that element of trust, you have to have common understanding of what your mission, but also how you're going to accomplish it. How much data is going to be open? How much is going to require, because there's vulnerable populations involved, like children, some sort of access committee just to vet that the best interests of the child or an adult with diminished capacities are best served. You need to have your publication policy, because there's young scholars that need to have their publications in order to have academic careers and be recognized as researchers and so on. You need to know, what about intellectual property? Does open science mean it doesn't exist? No. Open science is not anti-eventual patent or anti-eventual innovation, discovery, and licensing or whatever. It's more how to create the conditions that will foster trust through the governance structure of this common enterprise of building CONP.
Is it fair to say that then you have a kind of two-pronged mission, one dealing with privacy and the other dealing with intellectual property?
I would add to privacy and intellectual property the consent issues. Now, there are tissues involved in here. There's not just data, there's data coming from tissues, whether it's biopsy tissues or people who've had who've died of, let's say, Alzheimer's, had brain tissue collected afterwards. There are ongoing studies of people with depression. Can you really get consent for any of those cases that I just mentioned? Meaningful consent to share. Because there's no obligation to share in science, but you have to have clear, transparent conditions and an informed consent. Citizens understand that science does not progress without participation. Patients don't get better treatment if the patient before did not say, yes, you can use my medical record, yes, you can use my leftover blood, my leftover whatever. Everyone knows we have to be more systemic about it. And I think COMP, if properly governed and with that degree of trust, patients, researchers to researcher, and researcher to the world with the platform, is what governance is about.
We're both scientists, and we know that there is very strict checks with internal review boards and different kinds of procedures that we have to go through to actually obtain this consent. But we're also aware that there's countries in the world where these procedures are much faster and sometimes much looser. Can you comment on whether this is an advantage or a disadvantage for Canada?
I don't think Canada situates itself in, quotes, one of the looser kind of countries, where there are countries that have a much higher degree of state surveillance of their citizens under a common political approach, such as China, for instance. And it's part of the political ethos that citizens are in a collective to which they contribute, and their facial imaging and their records that are automatically in a shared system sounds wonderful from a scientific point of view, but it's not the notion of citizen that someone might have in a country like Denmark or Estonia. Now, Denmark or Estonia, they do have integrated systems of data using unique identifiers for every citizen so that they can improve their health system and put money where money should be and make it sustainable, universal, and equitable. And then you get the other extreme, the sort of me, myself, and I atomist approach, which is for every person is an individual, which is true, but you need an individual free consent for everything, as though you're living in a cave. And I think the sort of individualistic mindset is not that of Canadians, might be more of American participants. And so Canada situates itself somewhere in the middle in that range of approaches to, in quotes, personal privacy.
So looking to the future, I know that this is something that always comes up in everyday conversations, but first, do people have reason to be scared that the advances of genomics, neuroimaging, will really have negative effects on them? Or do you have a more optimistic view where this is really helping both them and science advance?
I think we need to have stricter mechanisms or frameworks in place to guard against, one, intentional malicious misuse, and two, access by officials who do not have the legal mandate to access. So we need to clean up what are the rules for the criminal sleuthing that goes on for cold cases and all these interesting forensic things we see on television and so on. Is it really a free-for-all, or are there rules in place for the security of the data that can only be accessed in certain cases because it was given for a totally different person? Totally different, well, it might have been a different person and for a different reason. I don't think that I'm unduly worried even about the friendly hackers. Today in Science, an article came out that some fellow was able, some brilliant computer scientist, to put this together and that together. But the reason he was able to do it is because the public themselves might have totally different views of privacy. We're so busy protecting privacy, but they're all putting everything else in the social media. This came from consumer genomic databases that he was able to make all these inferences, and finally through a public database, which is a reference database, presumably re-identify an individual. Okay, so it takes a lot of money, a lot of time, and a lot of genius to do that. And those were databases where the public had already thrown their, in quotes, personal privacy into the cloud. And so that if you're going to do it and have that attitude towards social media, well, then I think you should be forewarned that these kinds of re-identification scenarios are always possible.
Can you tell us a little bit about your background, how you came to do what you do?
In a very, not serendipity, let's say surrealistic route. I was in poetry, actually, surrealist poetry. And
Surrealist?
Surrealist poetry, wow. Yes. Looking at models of how colonized countries use literature, i.e. poetry, as a way, as a political form of expression against the colonizer by doing protest literature. If you take Quebec, for example, you could say that Joual, making the French not look like Parisian French was their way of protesting and communicating. And that happened in the Caribbean, and it happened in the African colonies and so on. It was a heyday of political protests, and one of my professors got into trouble, and I lost my thesis supervisor, my PhD thesis supervisor.
You lost him?
I lost him. Well, in other words, he lost his job because he got into political difficulties, and the university let him go. So then I thought, my goodness, if I do want to change the world, rather than teaching poetry, maybe I should do something. So I went into law, intending to go into criminal law, but it was just too awful. It was just, I can't accept that people want to harm each other. And so ended up looking for a field where there were no answers, and started in classical medical law, criminal law with bullets left in people's bodies. That could you go in and get the bullet out because you could trace it to the policeman's gun. And then finally ended up in genetics and genomics, and did my thesis on reproductive technology, my PhD thesis, reproductive technologies, just after Louise Brown was born. So I'm started in this wonderful world of emerging technologies with my thesis, and I haven't been bored since.
Do you still find a way to unite your interest in poetry with what you do today?
I think so. I gave the Galton lecture last year, and I managed for the first time to do my whole lecture by using poetry as an example of the same kind of ethical issues that are raised about, who's a person, where are we going, what does this mean, should we be doing this? And so hopefully in a year or 2 or 3, I can go back just to doing that.
That would be really interesting to see. Is it available anywhere? Was it recorded?
The Galton lecture is on the our Center for Genomics and Policy website.
Yeah. Wonderful. So we will put the link below this podcast. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. We really hope that this series of podcasts reaches a broader audience, because these issues of ethics and governance are something that doesn't concern just scientists. It concerns everybody in Canada. And we're really happy to have you on board to show us the way.
Great, I'm quite excited. And I'm not a neuroscience specialist, but the brain is like without limits. So, it's going to be fun.